Stop everything you are doing right now, because what is about to be revealed is not speculation, not analysis that will be walked back by morning press conferences, and not the kind of geopolitical theater that gets memory hold within a news cycle. At 0347 hours local time, the state of Israel did something it has never done in its entire 76-year history. Jerusalem formally requested immediate ceasefire negotiations with an adversary, while that adversary's weapons were still detonating across Israeli territory. The Israeli Defense Forces, an institution that has built its entire strategic doctrine on the principle of never negotiating under fire, never accepting terms while under attack, never showing weakness in the face of ongoing aggression, just shattered that foundational principle in a single unprecedented communication to international mediators. The reason is not political calculation. The reason is not diplomatic pressure from Washington. The reason is that 5 radiological dispersal devices, what the world knows as dirty bombs, have just detonated across Israel's economic and population centers, and the contamination readings are climbing past every prepared scenario that Israeli civil defense planners had ever modeled. The number that triggered this civilizational crisis is not the explosive yield of the devices themselves, which were relatively modest by conventional military standards. The number is the radioactive isotope concentration being measured in the fallout zones. Cesium-137 and cobalt-60 readings in central Tel Aviv are currently measuring 850 millisieverts per hour at ground zero locations, a radiation intensity 30 times beyond the threshold that triggers immediate mandatory evacuation protocols. This is not Chernobyl-level contamination, but it is persistent, widespread, and concentrated in the precise urban zones where Israel's economic engine operates, where its financial sector conducts the transactions that generate 40% of national GDP, where its technology companies employ the human capital that represents Israel's primary competitive advantage in the global economy. The International Atomic Energy Agency has confirmed through independent sensor networks that at least 3 of the 5 detonation sites show contamination patterns consistent with deliberate optimization for maximum area denial rather than maximum casualties. A technical signature that reveals sophisticated understanding of radiological weapon employment doctrine. Iran has not merely attacked Israel with dirty bombs. Iran has demonstrated a capability and willingness to render Israeli territory economically uninhabitable while keeping casualty counts low enough to complicate Israeli retaliation options under international law and alliance pressure. This is strategic brilliance wrapped in radiological contamination, and it has just rewritten every assumption about deterrence, escalation control, and acceptable weapons employment in the Middle Eastern strategic environment. If this channel has been delivering the analysis that cuts through the sanitized official narratives and the mainstream media's carefully managed coverage of Middle Eastern conflicts, this is the moment to ensure you never miss an update. Subscribe to this channel, activate the notification system, and share this analysis with everyone in your network who understands that we are watching the rules of regional warfare being permanently rewritten in real time. The analysis that follows takes you inside every dimension of this attack. The weapon design that made it possible, the strategic calculation that made it inevitable, and the civilizational consequences that make it irreversible. The dirty bomb employment began at 0347 local time with near simultaneous detonations at 5 locations selected for maximum strategic impact with minimum international condemnation risk. The target selection reveals operational planning that prioritized economic paralysis over mass casualties, a choice that demonstrates Iran understands exactly how to weaponize international law and global opinion against Israeli response options. The detonation sites were the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange Complex in the Central Business District, the Ramat Gan Diamond Exchange, which processes 60% of the world's polished diamond trade, the Herzliya Industrial Technology Park, where Israel's cybersecurity and military technology sector concentrates, the Haifa Port Southern Terminal, which handles 38% of Israel's maritime cargo volume, and the Ashdod Power Generation Facility that supplies electricity to Israel's entire southern region, including critical military installations in the Negev. Each device employed the same basic architecture, a conventional explosive core ranging from 80 to 120 kilograms of military-grade composition wrapped in a radiological dispersal matrix containing a combination of cesium-137 extracted from medical radiation therapy equipment and cobalt-60 sourced from industrial radiography systems. The explosive yields were deliberately modest, designed to aerosolize and disperse the radiological material across maximum area rather than to destroy structures or inflict blast casualties. Initial casualty reports confirm this design philosophy worked exactly as intended. Blast and fragmentation casualties across all 5 sites total approximately 240 individuals, with immediate fatalities numbering 47. These are tragic losses, but they represent roughly 1/10 the casualties that conventional explosive devices of equivalent size would have inflicted in identical target environments. The genius of the attack lies not in the immediate destruction, but in the persistent contamination. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30.17 years, meaning the radioactive decay process will require 3 decades just to reduce current radiation levels by 50%. Cobalt-60 has a half-life of 5.27 years, providing shorter duration but more intense radiation output during the initial contamination period. The combination creates a radiological environment that will require years of decontamination operations, during which the affected economic zones remain essentially unusable for normal commercial and residential purposes. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange cannot operate from a building measuring 850 millisieverts per hour. The diamond merchants cannot return to facilities where radiation exposure would exceed safe limits within minutes. The technology companies cannot ask employees to work in environments that guarantee long-term health consequences. The weapon components tell a story of procurement sophistication that Western intelligence agencies are still processing. Cesium-137 and cobalt-60 are not weapons-grade nuclear materials requiring complex enrichment facilities or advanced centrifuge cascades. They are industrial and medical isotopes available through civilian supply chains, present in thousands of facilities across the developing world, and subject to security protocols that are comprehensive on paper but porous in practice. Iran did not need to build a nuclear weapons program to acquire these materials. Iran needed networks capable of diverting industrial radiation sources, technical expertise sufficient to extract and process the isotopes, and operational discipline adequate to construct and deploy the devices without triggering detection. The intelligence failure dimension of this attack will occupy Western agencies for years. Israel's vaunted signals intelligence capabilities, the Unit 8200 collection architecture that monitors Iranian communications with resolution and penetration that few intelligence services can match, apparently detected nothing that indicated imminent dirty bomb deployment. Israel's human intelligence networks inside Iran, cultivated across decades of operations and representing billions of dollars in operational investment, apparently provided no warning that radiological devices were being prepared for employment against Israeli targets. The Mossad, an organization whose mystique is built on the premise that it knows what adversaries are planning before they fully commit to action, just experienced an intelligence breakdown of existential proportions. This failure reveals something profound about the evolution of Iranian operational security and the limitations of Israeli intelligence dominance. Iran is no longer the penetrable target that Israeli intelligence could map, monitor, and manipulate with confidence. Iran has learned how to compartmentalize operations, how to conduct planning below the threshold of signals intelligence collection, how to move materials and personnel without triggering the pattern recognition algorithms that Israeli systems employ. This represents a maturation of Iranian tradecraft that fundamentally alters the intelligence balance in the region. The immediate Israeli response tells the real story of how dramatically this attack has shifted strategic calculations. Within 90 minutes of the detonations, the Israeli Security Cabinet convened in the Emergency Command Facility beneath the Kiryat military headquarters in Tel Aviv. Within 4 hours, Israel communicated through Egyptian and Qatari intermediaries that it was prepared to discuss immediate ceasefire arrangements. This is not how Israel responds to attacks. Israel's entire strategic culture is built on immediate, overwhelming retaliation that demonstrates unacceptable costs for aggression against Israeli territory or Israeli citizens. Israel struck Syrian air defense networks within hours of Iranian missile attacks. Israel conducted retaliatory operations against Hezbollah within minutes of cross-border provocations. Israel's doctrine is escalation dominance, the demonstration that any attack against Israel will be met with retaliation so severe that adversaries regret their actions and avoid future aggression. Yet, facing radiological contamination across its economic core, Israel is requesting ceasefire negotiations. The calculation is brutal and unavoidable. Israel cannot retaliate against Iran with conventional strikes without risking Iranian escalation to additional dirty bomb employment. Iran has just demonstrated it possesses both the capability and willingness to deploy radiological weapons. Iran has also demonstrated restraint in casualty infliction, keeping deaths low enough that Israeli retaliation with strategic strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities or leadership targets would appear disproportionate to international audiences. Israel is trapped in a scenario where retaliation risks worse attacks, while non-retaliation accepts strategic humiliation. The contamination zones present challenges that dwarf anything Israel has confronted in its history of conflict management. Decontamination of urban areas contaminated with cesium-137 and cobalt-60 is not a matter of washing down buildings and declaring victory. It requires systematic removal of surface materials, soil excavation and replacement, careful disposal of contaminated materials in controlled facilities, and years of monitoring to verify that radiation levels have declined to safe thresholds. The cost estimates for proper decontamination of the 5 affected zones start at $12 billion and escalate rapidly depending on how thoroughly the work is conducted. The timeline estimates begin at 5 years for minimal functionality restoration and extend to 15 years for full decontamination to pre-attack background radiation levels. During this decontamination period, Israel loses access to economic infrastructure that cannot be quickly replaced. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange can relocate its trading operations to backup facilities, but the clustering of financial services firms, investment banks, and fintech companies around the exchange created network effects that generated outsized economic value. Those companies cannot simply relocate without losing the collaborative advantages that made Tel Aviv a global financial hub. The diamond trade can shift to Antwerp or Mumbai, but once that trade migrates, the expertise, the relationships, and the infrastructure advantages that made Ramat Gan central to global diamond commerce are lost permanently. The Herzliya Technology Corridor represented decades of investment in creating an innovation ecosystem. That ecosystem is not easily reconstructed in alternate locations, especially when the reconstruction must happen under crisis conditions. The Haifa port contamination creates immediate logistical nightmares. Israel's maritime trade flows through 3 major ports, and losing operational capacity at Haifa forces cargo diversion to Ashdod and the smaller Eilat facility. This creates congestion, delays, and increased costs throughout Israel's import and export supply chains at precisely the moment when economic disruption is already hammering business confidence and investment flows. The Ashdod power facility contamination forces electricity rationing across southern Israel, affecting both civilian populations and military installations that depend on grid power for operations and readiness. Iran has just taught the world a lesson in asymmetric warfare that every regional power is absorbing with intense interest. You do not need nuclear weapons to inflict strategic damage on technologically advanced economies. You need radiological dispersal devices, careful target selection, and operational discipline sufficient to deploy the weapons without triggering preemptive action. The attack on Israel demonstrates that dirty bombs, long dismissed by Western defense establishments as terror weapons with limited strategic value, can be employed in ways that create economic paralysis, complicate retaliation calculations, and shift regional power balances. If you value analysis this deep, this willing to examine what mainstream defense commentary refuses to acknowledge, subscribe now to ensure you receive every update as this crisis continues to develop. The analysis ahead examines how the United States is responding, why Israel's deterrence architecture just collapsed, and what Iran's demonstration of radiological warfare capability means for conflicts from Ukraine to the Taiwan Strait. The American response to the dirty bomb attacks reveals a superpower struggling with a strategic environment it no longer controls. Within 6 hours of the detonations, the White House released a statement condemning the attacks, reaffirming support for Israeli security, and calling for international investigations to identify responsibility and accountability. This is the language of impotence dressed up as diplomatic resolve. The statement contained no threats, no ultimatums, no indication that American military power would be employed to retaliate against Iran or deter further attacks. The statement could have been written about any regional conflict where the United States wishes to appear engaged while actually remaining on the sidelines. The Pentagon's operational response consists of repositioning carrier strike groups, increasing air patrol frequencies, and enhancing intelligence collection. These are the standard gestures of American military presence, demonstrating capability without indicating willingness to employ that capability. The USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group, already in the eastern Mediterranean, received orders to maintain station rather than execute any offensive operations. American combat aircraft based in Qatar and the UAE increased sortie rates for intelligence gathering missions, but have not been authorized for strikes against Iranian territory or Iranian proxy forces. This American paralysis reflects calculations that extend far beyond the immediate crisis in Israel. The United States is managing simultaneous strategic challenges in Europe, where support for Ukraine consumes military resources and political attention, in the Pacific, where Taiwan contingencies require force planning and alliance coordination, and in the Middle East, where multiple conflicts demand attention without offering clear paths to favorable resolution. Every percentage point of American military capability committed to one theater is capability unavailable for other theaters where peer competitors are probing for weakness and opportunity. China is watching the American response to Iranian radiological warfare with intense focus. If the United States cannot or will not retaliate against Iran for dirty bomb attacks on a major treaty ally, what does this reveal about American willingness to respond to Chinese gray zone operations against Taiwan or aggressive behavior in the South China Sea? Russia is conducting similar assessments regarding Ukraine, European security, and the credibility of American extended deterrence commitments. The global implications of American restraint in the face of Iranian radiological attacks extend far beyond the Middle East. The Israeli deterrence model just experienced catastrophic failure, and the consequences will shape Middle Eastern security dynamics for decades. Israel's strategic doctrine since 1948 has rested on the assumption that overwhelming conventional military superiority combined with nuclear weapons capability creates sufficient deterrence to prevent existential threats from materializing. Any adversary contemplating serious aggression against Israel must confront the reality of devastating conventional retaliation followed, if necessary, by nuclear employment. This deterrence architecture kept Israel secure through multiple conventional wars and countless smaller conflicts. Iran has just demonstrated that radiological weapons can circumvent this entire deterrence structure. Dirty bombs are not nuclear weapons, so their employment does not trigger the nuclear threshold that would justify Israeli nuclear retaliation. Yet, dirty bombs can inflict economic damage that approaches or exceeds what conventional military campaigns could achieve. Iran can now impose strategic costs on Israel without crossing the nuclear threshold, creating a capability gap that Israeli deterrence planning never adequately addressed. The ceasefire negotiation request represents an acknowledgement by Israeli leadership that the old strategic model no longer functions in a radiological warfare environment. Israel cannot deter attacks. It cannot prevent and cannot respond to without risking escalation. It cannot control. This realization is forcing fundamental reassessment of Israeli strategy, defense priorities, and national security planning. The next decade of Israeli security policy will be defined by attempts to adapt to the radiological threat environment that Iran has just created. This night has permanently altered the Middle Eastern strategic landscape in ways that will take years to fully manifest. Iran has demonstrated that regional powers can develop and employ weapons of mass disruption that fall below the threshold of nuclear warfare while achieving comparable strategic effects. Israel has demonstrated that even the most sophisticated military power in the region can be forced into negotiations by adversaries willing to accept international condemnation in pursuit of strategic advantage. The United States has demonstrated that global superpower status does not translate into willingness or ability to prevent or reverse regional catastrophes when the costs of intervention exceed perceived benefits. Subscribe to this channel because in a world where dirty bombs can paralyze advanced economies, where deterrence architectures collapse in the face of unconventional threats, and where superpowers watch allies suffer attacks without mounting effective responses, this comprehensive and This honest is not optional, it is survival. Share this with everyone who needs to understand that the rules of warfare just changed and the implications extend far beyond Israel and Iran. The world after tonight is a world where radiological terrorism has become strategic statecraft, where economic warfare can be waged through contamination rather than conventional strikes, and where the assumptions that guided security planning for 70 years no longer hold. History will mark this moment as the night when the Middle East entered the radiological age, when deterrence based on conventional and nuclear superiority proved inadequate against adversaries willing to innovate in the spaces between traditional warfare categories. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never stop questioning the narratives that assume the old order still functions, when everything we just witnessed proves that order is collapsing in real time.